So thank you for joining the webinar titled Beyond Replication, IT Resilience Strategies and Best Practices for the Modern Enterprise. This webinar is being presented by Webair Zerto. My name is Sagi Brody. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Webair, and today I'm joined by Deepak Verma, who's the Director of Product Strategy at Zerto. Hey Deepak, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Sagi. My pleasure to be here today.
Okay, so just a few minutes of housekeeping. If you don't know Webair, we're a provider of managed cloud infrastructure, private cloud, network services, as well as hybrid cloud, disaster recovery, and offsite backups. We've been in business for about 20 years, really come from the application hosting space. So we've been providing production hosting for critical applications, mostly for web-facing infrastructure. And we sort of provided a focus on BCDR starting about 6 or 7 years ago. We've been doing it for our own internally hosted customers, and then we figured we'd offer it out to customers for their own existing infrastructure as well. It's been going really well, having a great deal of infrastructure components in our tool belt, being able to offer network integrations, and various flavors of firewalls and direct connectivity. All those things that come from the web hosting world that we came from have served us really well for complex disaster recovery integrations, which we'll get into. We've also been recognized by some of the industry analysts over the last few years, such as Gartner and IDC and some others, including being mentioned in the Disaster Recovery as a Service Magic Quadrant. So Deepak, I'll let you give the Zerto intro here, which I don't think it deserves an intro, but I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, sure thing. So hopefully, you all have worked with Zerto in the past, so I'll keep it pretty brief. But Zerto, we provide a single platform that covers disaster recovery, backup, cloud mobility into a single platform specifically for IT resilience. And what the platform is really focused on is delivering a number of key use cases. Disaster recovery, what we're very well known for in the industry. In the last couple of versions, we've also expanded into backup and restore use cases, again, using the continuous data protection approach. We also added capabilities to do long-term retention for archival and compliance purposes. And obviously expanded that platform not just to the on-prem requirements or on-prem private clouds, but also extending into public clouds. And one of the things that we'll talk about here is all the other use cases beyond just test and dev that the journal affords customers to be able to utilize.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I don't really run into too many people these days who don't know what Zerto is or what it's done. So I think you hit the market hard. Great product, and seems to be very popular. So we're here really to talk about strategies and best practices related to disaster recovery for enterprise organizations. So Zerto is a great component of that. Replication is the bare minimum requirement, but where we notice a lot of enterprises, maybe not struggling, but hitting blockers or kind of not being able to implement a DR strategy maybe as quickly as they'd like, is really around everything else that wraps around the replication. And so when we talk about disaster recovery, it's not just backups, right? DR is not just data that you replicate or copy somewhere else that you can boot up if and when needed or rehydrate. It really has nothing to do with backups. If you happen to use a tool that can provide you with long-term archival backups and provide you with image-based replication that you can boot up, that's great. But people really need to understand that backups and disaster recovery are two different use cases with two different goals, and may or may not require two different pieces of software or strategies or infrastructure. And really the reality with DR is the networking, in order for it to be successful, the networking has to be the same at the recovery site. If your production environment is inclusive of multiple different platforms, let's say virtualization, physical servers, direct storage, you have to cover 100% of production. So there's a lot of interesting requirements for a legitimate disaster recovery strategy above and beyond just setting up a replication tool. Another way to put it would be, let's say you were hit with ransomware tomorrow and you have a quote unquote DR strategy or backups that you can restore, rehydrate. What's less painful? You know, would you be able to enact the DR strategy that you had in place, or would it be less painful to pay a hacker $10,000 or $15,000? And you know, when I speak to a lot of people that have a DR strategy, we start to ask some of these questions, and it's more like offsite backups with some manual patchwork that can be done. So let's get into, you know, where some of the gotchas are and some of the strategies to mitigate them. But you know, as we mentioned before, the base requirement is replication. You do have to get that part solved, and Zerto does a good job of it. So Deepak, I'll pass to you maybe to talk about how Zerto accomplishes that core requirement there.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the core differentiator and what we've done successfully for 10 years, and we keep building on it, is been the continuous replication nature of the product. So, you know, unlike a streaming-based snapshot, a streaming-based backup that you can probably achieve once a day, twice a day at the most, or snapshots that you can achieve maybe once an hour if you're really aggressive, continuous data replication allows you to basically get a continuous stream of IOs, and most of our customers enjoy 5 to 10 second RPOs, which means that's the data loss that you're really willing to live with, which is, you know, minimal in these days. And then we couple that with journal-based recovery. So out of that continuous replication, we maintain the IO flows or the IOs into a continuous journal. I think if you could go back one slide, sorry. We maintain it in a journal, which allows you to pick different checkpoints, right? So if something has happened 5 seconds ago, you can roll back to that. If something, you know, you didn't pick that up for a couple of hours, you can go back to that and then extend that to anywhere into days. And I'll talk about how it can get into even years with a long-term journal. And then the second part of it, or the other half of the equation, is while we can do it in a continuous manner with journals, it's also being able to realize and recognize the applications that are living in the top level. Because a lot of times it doesn't help to just recover the data unless you can recover the entire application. That's what the business cares about. And then I kind of see long-term data retention as a necessity depending on what industry you are. If you're, you know, financial and you have to keep data for 7 years minimum. If you're healthcare, you have to keep data for 30 plus years. There's a nature there to, you know, be able to obviously keep that data for a while. Now we can put a different lens to this and think about what that recovery is from, whether it's from, you know, traditional DR events, or which more customers have been facing recently in the last couple of years has been more around recovery from cyber events. Sorry, could go to the next slide. Yeah. So another important aspect, or building on that points I talked about in the previous slide, it's really looking at it from an application standpoint. So instead of being able to say, hey, you know, my app server was backed up at 8 o'clock and it finished at 10, and then my web server somewhere started at 9 and it finished at 10:05. My database server didn't finish till midnight. My file servers didn't finish till 3 in the morning. You get kind of this splattering of applications throughout various points in time. With a journal and based approach, and also recognition of applications, you're really recovering the entire application, whatever you define that application to be, a set of VMs that need to work together up to a specific point in time, and that's atomically consistent. As you can kind of see from the timeline, everything comes up to a point in time. And oh, by the way, if one point in time is not good enough, then you can roll back to the other. So, you know, when I talked about earlier about the use cases, test dev, etc., whatever customers can do with journals, especially this has been useful in ransomware, because most customers recognize it hits at a certain time. And maybe they want to roll back to a more recent time, but then they have a thought to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe these were infected and affected points, but it was dormant. So maybe we need to go back to further points. So you've got the flexibility to play those what if games without having to spend a lot of time in recovering. So that's why application recovery is consistency is important as well.
Great. Thanks, Deepak. So yeah, so if we have once we have a great sort of replication tool available, right? That will, I think, definitely handle moving over the images, either let's say they're sourced off VMware or Hyper-V or public cloud. We have a consistent point in time snapshot of application groupings of VMs, and I think that's, fortunately, that seems to be the majority of where the workloads are today. And so, using a tool like Zerto, or using a service provider like Webair, who will bring Zerto along with it, really provides coverage for where the majority of the workloads are sitting in a really easy to use orchestrated manner where failover and failback is straightforward. On the other hand, production environments are made up of more than just virtualization today, and for whatever reason, we as providers are still seeing a good amount of physical servers, be it Linux or Windows, as well as storage integrations that are not being presented through hypervisors. We see customers using direct block storage into virtual machines. Same thing with CIFS and NFS, as well as other non-x86 platforms like IBM, iSeries and P-Series. And then there's other type of workloads too, like VDI and voice over IP infrastructure that really requires its own set of tools. And so you really have to consider, what is the strategy going to be for all of these other ancillary platforms? And replication is not always the solution. A lot of applications actually provide sort of inherent high availability or clustering themselves, and depending on the application, if there is something like that available, that sometimes that's more advantageous. The great example years ago, before Office 365 was prevalent, was creating sort of DAG clusters for exchange between production and DR. I think a good example of that today is more likely the SQL servers, where if you have a SQL server and it's servicing multiple applications, are you replicating it with one app? And if you want to do individual application failover, do you fail over the SQL server with the app that failed? And what happens, back at production with other applications that are still talking to that server? You end up with a split brain scenario. So in that example, maybe an availability group is better, or maybe individual smaller SQL servers per application is better too. So in addition to replication, you have to look at each of your apps and say, does this need to be always on? Does the application provide me inherent built-in capabilities to maintain consistency and high availability? Or do I want to just run a separate instance of it? Like with voice over IP, you can easily run another sort of instance of your infrastructure and use DNS SRV records for high availability. So I think a lot of people like to start with replication, but replication is sort of a means to an end. Start with your application list and figure out what is the best strategy for each one of my applications. VDI is another great example. Replicating VDI infrastructure, Citrix or VMware Horizon, can be done, but there's a lot of caveats around that. So sometimes it's better to build a separate VDI around the disaster recovery. And so at Webair, we've helped a lot of customers answer these questions. We're not sort of here to be like, oh yeah, we can replicate your infrastructure. It's more about, let's take an inventory, understand the RTO/RPO requirements for each layer, and provide a strategy for all of them. And so these are sort of what I see on this list here on this slide are some of the gotchas related to to disaster recovery for enterprises, and we'll jump into a bunch of them in more detail now. Taking a step back, before we even sort of start on a DR strategy, and I think sometimes people gloss this step over, is what are we trying to accomplish? What type of failover events are we trying to protect against? And everybody sort of gravitates towards the full site failover. My facility is down. Natural disaster. That's great, and obviously we do want to protect against those. But the more likely scenario where we see DR being used is not that extreme example. It's the more common ones of application problems, database corruption, human error, individual hardware components. Think about those too. Those are, I think, more likely. And if you want to protect against those, then your entire strategy has to change a little bit, because in reality, achieving the full site failover failback capability is easier than the individual server or application, from a networking perspective. And so Think about what you're trying to achieve. Try to implement a phased approach. If you have no capability today, then the full site failover is simpler because of the networking requirements around it. And maybe start with that as sort of a phase one, and then look to achieve partial failover capabilities later, or per application failover capabilities as a phase two. Deepak, what are you seeing? Are you do people sort of just assume that they can achieve all different types of protection for failure scenarios, or are people realizing that there's different nuances depending on the goals?
Well, it's all over the spectrum. I think the traditional thinking is still in the sense that we all kind of envision the smoking hole scenario that needs to be recovered from. But what tends to happen, I mean, yeah, that there's still natural disasters. We've had a couple of customers, in California, unfortunately, being affected by the wildfires out there, where they have to preemptively shut data centers. Might either be affected by a brownout or the fire's getting too close. So those type of scenarios still happen, but we can count those on one hand in a year, the major events. The other type of events have really been micro disasters. So that's within the four walls of the data center, where individual components may fail, hardware components fail, software components may fail, human error. But then, I kind of bring back to the ones we always kind of hear about when customers come back to us have been the ransomware attacks, where their data has been frozen, and then have to make a decision between pay or recover.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with that, right? And the other thing too, I think to consider is testing. You have to have a strategy around how are you going to test the applications at the DR site, and will you be sitting on the same network? Will you be hitting the applications on the same sort of DNS and host names that you use them for production? And testing can also be dangerous. If you spin up your applications and have unfettered access to the internet, and your applications are actually interacting with other apps that are on the internet, maybe SaaS providers or Salesforce or ADFS, and you start testing the application, you have the potential to actually modify production data sitting out there as part of your DR testing. And so there's a whole other aspect of this related to how do we set up a proper network for testing to ensure that you actually don't do more damage to your production. And if your systems are speaking to third-party infrastructure on the public internet, then what do? Can you actually test your applications properly? And there's different ways to deal with that. Some of these platforms will provide you with sandbox credentials, or maybe a different login and password for the testing environment. And so now what do? Are you going to modify your application and have a little bit so it knows if it's in test or production to know which endpoint to hit, or maybe you put a proxy at your DR site to proxy all the requests to stop them and automatically reroute them to the sandbox environment. I mean, that's something that we've seen that's very safe, because you're going to ensure that when you test, there's absolutely no opportunity to affect production in a negative way. And it also kind of puts a firewall where during a legitimate test, you can hit the AB switch and tell it to hit the third party via production, and that requires no application changes. We definitely don't want to be making application changes or even going to a config file and saying, hey, now I'm in DR in order for these things to function properly. So keep that in mind when building up a testing strategy. It's definitely something that needs forethought. And then I think the big one here, the biggest issue is really networking. I think people think of disaster recovery as a replication problem. Tools like Zerto have sort of made that component of it sort of go away. I think of DR always from a networking perspective, and how are we going to make the applications consumable to the end users the way that they are in production without any changes. And if you look at a tool like Zerto, it talks about per application failover. Which it does, right? But there's caveats. As long as your applications are each in their own private subnet, in their own VLAN or in their own IP range, then you can do it. But it's really not the case always with enterprise organizations. I've seen a lot of very large organizations who have one big flat network where all the applications and even desktops and workstations are all kind of intermingled there, and achieving per application failover failback is not terribly easy in that scenario. And so, and unfortunately, that's why a lot of these DR strategies people will set up replication, they can boot up their VMs at the DR site, but then they get to this point, how are we going to make them consumable? And then they kind of get stuck. And so there are strategies to mitigate this. If your applications are available within an internal network, maybe your organization has a private MPLS network or some sort of VPN mesh or VPLS or SD-WAN, and you're using dynamic routing on top of that, you're in a great position because now you can obviously just internally announce the same IPs from the DR site. You don't have to change any of your IPs. You can also achieve this with sort of static routes, with firewalls, and there's some good options there, and there's a lot of flexibility there too. If you have one of those types of networks, at Webair we can configure the routers to advertise those internal IPs locally. For external networks, if you're running publicly available applications, then you can you can do the traditional DNS change, and nothing wrong with that. I would recommend you have low TTLs in your zone files in advance, and maybe the failover IP already there but commented out to make it easier. Or you can use some of these newer DNS providers that sort of automate that for you. If you look at DNS providers like NS1 or OpenDNS or DNS Made Easy, they can actually do health checks and automatically fail over DNS to your secondary site and keep the TTLs low for you. Or you can just have log into the portal and hit a button. So I think that's a really great win on the DNS side. Or you can do one better. You can proxy all of your requests through like an application proxying service like a Cloudflare or an Akamai, and they'll automatically pull from the DR when they see production down. That's all automated and it's great, but keep in mind in that scenario you're now proxying your request through the third party at all times, not just when you're in DR, and they're typically charging per request, so it can get expensive. But regardless, we have a lot of better strategies today for public IP failover than just going into a zone file and manually changing a DNS record. Some of the DNS services I mentioned, you can achieve some level of automation at an inexpensive cost. A lot of people like to talk about the public IP announcement strategy too. Like, oh, I own my own IP addresses. I can just advertise them from my DR site via BGP. No IP changes. That might be true, but keep in mind it's only going to help you for the full failover scenario. You can't fail over or announce one IP address from the DR site. It has to be an entire C class, an entire /24. So that only helps you with the full site failover scenario. It doesn't allow you to provide application level failover capabilities. And so I kind of like to dissuade people. We set it up, we have it in our back pocket for the full site failover, but it's not the primary strategy. And then the last thing I wanted to mention too is networking to third parties. If you have private connectivity at your production, let's say to your MPLS network, or point to points, or private connectivity to like a Bloomberg feed, or Fiserv for financial data, the traditional way of dealing with that was installing a duplicate of those links at the DR site, and having a second link to monitor and manage and maintain, second sets of routers, doubling the cost of all your links. And I think in the DR world, this has been a necessary evil, right? Maybe there hasn't been any other way to deal with that. But what we've been doing at Webair is leveraging some software-defined networking technology that's out there that allows us to virtualize the interconnection the same way that we kind of virtualize the virtual server images. And so there's network as a service platforms that are out there. Equinix has something called ECX. There's companies like Megaport and Packet Fabric and Console that are offering these network platforms where you can actually take those physical cross connects, your MPLS links, your connections to your third parties, and pin it on their platform, pin it to their infrastructure, and then they'll flow, and then it'll flow right back to your production. You'll establish a cross connect with them, and you'll have all those connections. But during a DR event, you can log into their portal and you can redirect those physical cross connects to your DR site. Or you can do it automatically, all software defined, just as if that physical cross connect was like a VM image. You can manipulate it the same way. And that's really great because now we don't need to pay for double the amount of circuits and have all this operational overhead, and we can really bring the physical networking to this sort of software-defined world. So this is really fun stuff, and at Webair we don't sell those services, but we integrate with them because they make our lives easier, and the Runbook is much shorter and less to manage, and everything becomes less expensive for the customers. Likewise, we talked about some of the networking strategies before, but you might already be using, let's say, SD-WAN in your environment, or maybe software-defined security tools like zero trust tools. Those are tools that also provide us with some capability to make disaster recovery easier. Because at the heart, they're really just networking tools, and they give us a really nice interface. And so again, I can go into my SD-WAN controller and I can build a policy for every one of my applications to say that, hey, this single application, this single IP lives at my DR site and not at production. And I can leave that policy disabled at all times. And when I need to fail over a single application, I can just enable that policy in my SD-WAN controller or interface, and now my entire organization is gonna use the DR site for that one app, and I'm not touching routers, I'm not touching firewalls, I'm not changing DNS, and this is great because now the DR teams can achieve disaster recovery capabilities without necessarily having to go to the network team every time, and to maintain strategies that prevail regardless of if physical routers or firewalls are swapped out by the networking team. So workload mobility is certainly enhanced by some of the new software-defined networking tools that are out there. Another component too that we really need to consider is dependencies. In order for let's say I'm replicating a whole bunch of applications with Zerto, and I boot them up. Another thing to consider is, well, what do they need to function properly? Typically, these application groupings, these VPGs, are self-contained bundles. If your application is made up of 3 web servers, 2 app servers, and a database server, those are going to be replicated together and come up. But what about authentication? What about sort of two-factor proxying? What about LDAP? So typically we recommend running those services always on at the DR site. That's how we typically do it for our customers. You have a domain controller that's replicating with production. You have your two-factor proxy already sitting at the DR site. Anything related to security or networking or authentication should always be on at the DR site and always available. It's not something you want to deal with during a disaster. And so if you have, let's say, 30 firewalls or deployed at all your sites, the DR site is just another site, and you're just going to maintain that firewall the same way, and it's always going to be on. We spoke a little bit before about the shared SQL server scenario. We talked a little bit about VDI earlier as well, and so again with VDI, there's a lot of gotchas. You can certainly replicate components of VDI, but and this is important, the decisions you make for what your production infrastructure looks like dictates your DR capabilities. So to the extent that you get fancy and more you get more complicated with your production VDI, is to the extent that it's going to be more painful to replicate it and to maintain that at DR. So Deepak, I'll ask you. Do you see VDI come up? I know Zerto can replicate some of the components.
Yeah. So given the recent events, obviously with the pandemic going on and a lot of people working from home, VDI, there's been a lot of focus on VDI, getting people sort of access to workstations in a very short amount of time, and actually that's been grown considerably. So we get asked this question quite a bit about protecting that VDI environment. VDI goes down or something affects it, you basically have a massive workforce now that is not productive. So the interesting thing there is it doesn't, in a lot of cases, it doesn't make sense to actually replicate the running VDI instances. So, imagine your desktop or your laptop, if you're connected to a session today through work, really what we care about is that persistent data, that needs to always be available, which is like file shares and things like that. But everything else is ephemeral. The workstation image itself can go away and come back. So in that case, what we tend to protect is more of the templates and the images, the gold images, if you will, that would be needed to recreate the VDI environment, as well as those instances that are holding the data. So if I've got a file server, some virtual file server sitting somewhere that it has all the home shares, directories, or working directories. Those type of virtual machines will be protected. But in general, it doesn't make a lot of sense to protect the entire running VDI environment. That'll be a lot of resource consumption with very little benefit.
Awesome. Yeah, and I do agree. I think a hybrid strategy makes a lot of sense for VDI, and when leveraging tools like Zerto for the components, that can be replicated. And then, the last one is the legacy platforms. Webair does a lot of disaster recovery for large enterprise organizations, hospitals, banks, financial services, and sure enough, we see an IBM I series or an IBM P series. We see these physical boxes. So, ensuring that your strategy can take those into account. And there are great tools and services that can handle all those. We do provide it as a service, and just because it's not VMware Hyper-V does not mean that you can't achieve the same level of capability. Your RPO is not going to be as low. We'll wait for Zerto maybe to come out with something one day, which may or may not happen. But you can still achieve a complete end-to-end DR strategy for all those other platforms. Another thing to consider too is, where is your target infrastructure? Where is your DR infrastructure, sitting? If you're targeting a public cloud, that's fine. I mean, you can target a public cloud. You can target a disaster recovery as a service provider like Webair, where it's our own infrastructure. You can target your own infrastructure. But one of the things that I think that's important to realize is to ensure that your target infrastructure or your DR target can conform to the existing standards you've created for your network and your network integration model. And for security, if you've built a security framework that has certain controls and compliances in place, be sure that this infrastructure isn't a one-off to those rules that you've built. If you are using third-party infrastructure, make sure that they conform to your compliance requirements. If you're a healthcare organization, and maybe you need the third party to sign a BAA, be sure that it's actually covering the managed replication or the networking. If you're going to a public cloud, it's a great platform, but understand, what are you responsible for in that scenario? Who's accountable for the security, and what will they sign a BAA for and not for? And so really this comes down to accountability and ownership. What do you want to be accountable and responsible for as it relates to the DR infrastructure? If it gets hacked, do you want to be on the hook for the compliance? So all good things to consider, especially if you're a compliance-minded organization. Compliance is also an area where where we have to keep in mind for testing. So if you are mandated to test once a year or twice a year or more, how do you actually prove that you've done a test? How do you prove that it's been successful? What does successful look like? Is it just booting up the VMs? Is it having the actual application owners, logging in and confirming? And so this is actually an area where Zerto can add a lot of value. So Deepak, I know I've personally seen some of the reports, and I think we have some screenshots here. Maybe you want to get into some detail on these great Zerto reports.
Yeah, sure. So, we talked about the test dev kind of use cases, or even for ransomware. One of the things that internal and external compliance requires is that the applications, and really I guess that again goes to the application, can be recovered in the event of a real disaster. So what you're seeing here is a failover test report, right? So we generate a report that helps the auditors be satisfied from a business side that their application is recoverable. It goes through, let's say you've done a test, right? You've identified an application, you've picked a point in time, and you've chosen that to be tested. So first and foremost, you can test that in an isolated bubble without affecting production. So that's important, right? Because the idea there is that DR tests shouldn't be this daunting task, spending an entire weekend at another facility. I've been through those in my career, and they're not fun for everybody. There should be as simple as clicking a button, testing an application, letting the apps folks kind of run through it. So this is what Zerto provides, and as part of that it's the report from that test, right? How do you document that you've tested it and prove to the auditors that it was successful? This is what it's doing. It shows the steps that were done, all the various components of that application, the VMs that were brought over, what the the status was, so you could see it succeeded bringing all of the parts of the application up, times, dates, etc., RTOs that are achieved as well, and then it can be signed and submitted. So a lot of our customers keep this as their proof for their auditors to say, yeah, we've not only tested, we've successfully tested, and here's the results from the individual DR tests. It's pretty easy to do, especially if you've got dozens of applications, different groups, different business units. Instead of getting everybody spun up, which should be kind of hard to do anyways these days, it's easy to just test application by application and stagger those out through the year. So, Sagi, it kind of goes back to your earlier point about testing. In my opinion, you should always be testing all the time, right? To test a small test this weekend, another test next weekend, and so on and so forth, or even during the week. This makes it possible.
Yeah, it's testing is just another one of those things where I don't know if it's just that IT teams are overwhelmed and they there's so many things going on, but what I've noticed is customers will come to us because maybe they've been audited and they need DR, and we get halfway through the integration, we get Zerto up and running, we start replicating, everything is replicating, and then they breathe a sigh of relief. And then maybe I don't know if they're going and dealing with 30 other things on their audit that are unrelated to DR or maybe security, but we don't hear from them. They never finish the integration. They never finish the DR strategy. They never test, and we never get to write the full runbook, which is something that we want to do, obviously. So I think it's just important for everyone to know it's a lot more than just having your infrastructure replicated. So speaking of runbooks, obviously you have to have sort of a procedure documented, not only for failover, but you have to have the failback procedure documented, and you have to have the testing procedure documented. And obviously we spoke about a lot so far. All of the different components that we spoke about, and the networking and the always on stuff, all of those nuances have to be covered in the runbook. And there's only so much you can automate. You're going to have applications that are going to be finicky, and you might have to do something in an app. So make sure it's documented in a nice document management system as well. So I think we would be remiss here if we did not mention security on a disaster recovery webinar. And so I did want to touch on that. Obviously, no one needs to be sold fear or told what the environment is out there related to ransomware attacks and all that, and there's all these great examples. And so we want to talk a little bit about that. People automatically assume that if I have a disaster recovery strategy, or rather if I'm replicating my data somewhere, and or if I'm backing up my data somewhere, then I'm immune to ransomware, or at least I can recover. And I think it's a false sense of security. That may or may not be the case, but you really have to, again, go deeper into your strategy and understand, to what extent can I recover? What are the type of ransomware events that I can recover from? Are my backups exposed, to the attacker? So, just because you have something in the realm of disaster recovery does not automatically mean that you can recover from a ransomware attack. And so again, I'm going to kick it back to you, Deepak, because I know this is really, I think, where Zerto shines as a tool, and it really can help protect against these types of events.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we've been, like I said, we've been in business for over 10 years. We've been helping customers for over 10 years now. And the interesting thing about this is that ransomware attacks were not prevalent back 10 years ago. They've obviously come up in the last 5 years or so, at least, we've become more mainstream. So this is another use case of an existing technology that we developed, a while ago, that our customers have patted us on the back for, and continue to do that every single time we hear from a customer that's successfully recovered. So the whole point of the journal-based recovery is that unlike a backup, you can go to a running copy, identify a copy seconds before you think that the ransomware hit occurred, spin that up. You can spin it up in a test environment, or you can spin it up in a real environment, recommend a test environment, see everything is fine, and then actually use that to start production up. In a lot of cases, we may not know that it's in this example 170151. So first and foremost, we're losing only 4 seconds of data. Second of all, if it's a couple of that doesn't work for me, it's very easy for me to granularly go to any number of times. I think this is a phenomenal capability that really lends itself to fighting ransomware attacks in a more, I'd say, safer manner, or in a more confident manner. And it doesn't have to apply to an individual, VM. It could just be for files. Maybe you're just only using that to recover files. It could be some VMs. It could be entire applications. That's which comprise VMs, or customers have used it for entire sites. If their entire site's been infected, rolling back to the entire site to a specific point in time. So it's pretty powerful technology.
Thanks. So I'm going to just move it on to this slide.
Yeah. And this is important as well, because you think of the running journal to say, okay, if you think of it as a DVR functionality for your production environment, well, that's great as long as I've got the capacity to run that for my short term. So our journal goes anywhere from a couple of hours to the maximum of 30 days, which is our arbitrary limit that we've put in there on production. So I've had some customers even say, look, we account for 14 days, we just keep 14 days in our journal, and we forgo traditional backups, for example, because we know we can recover files, photos, VMs, etc. from that. But then what happens from a long-term perspective? And I've had these discussions with some customer panels as well, and other analysts, where they'll come back and say, well, what if the actual environment, including the Zerto environment, gets affected? Where's the other copy? So what we did a couple of versions ago was give you the ability to take that short-term journal, and by short-term we mean anywhere from an hour to 30 days, and then take points from there and actually push it to another storage. And the popular target for that storage these days tends to be cloud, because there's really separation of both of data and control, right? The chances of if let's say your physical infrastructure being affected, and at the same time, a public cloud vendor, Amazon, Azure, Google's infrastructure being affected at the physical level is near impossible. So that tends to be a safe place to keep the data, what traditionally would be in the Iron Mountain type methodology. So what the long term allows you to do is basically pull those points out of the journal. And so, for example, I can say, hey, Zerto, pull my daily points. Let's say it's my midnight for these applications, and park them over here in this target an S3 or blob. And oh, by the way, put a retention on there for 7 years so that nobody can delete it for 7 years. So this is where the long-term journal comes in. And last I checked in the GUI, I was able to put 9,999 years. So, it's definitely a long-term journal. So then the idea is you don't want to keep secondly data for that long, right? The idea is if you're keeping stuff around for 30 years, maybe you'll just care about your monthlies or yearlies. So it's really this elastic journal concept.
Yeah, it is cool that you can kind of change the resolution of the checkpoints based on the how old the data is. That's great, the roll-ups. So I think the other thing to consider too is, okay, so we spoke about how a proper disaster recovery strategy can help protect against ransomware and provide sort of that reactive capability for security. But another thing that people don't really consider is, well, gee, if you have a replica of all your most critical applications sitting out there somewhere, either on the on a public cloud or your own infrastructure or a provider like Webair, that's maybe something that needs to be protected. All your applications are somewhere else, and you need to treat them with the same protection and security that you're doing with production. And that means installing the same sort of IDS and IPS monitoring capabilities. If you're using a third-party managed security company or SOC servers, they better be monitoring your actual DR site. And so before you figure out where your DR target is going to be or what you're going to do with DR, ensure that it does conform to your security strategy. Ensure that you can monitor, ensure that you can protect it. Because what you don't want to happen is for someone to attack your production, force you to fail over to DR, and then now you have exposure because your DR infrastructure is not as protected as production was. And so at Webair, we always advocate whatever your security strategy is at production. If you have some physical box sitting there that's doing sniffing or a tap, be sure you have it at the DR site. We actually allow our customers to deploy those boxes in front of our DR infrastructure. And again, so that the DR site is not a one-off to your rules. The other cool thing is now if you have those security tools and capabilities at the DR site, and you can use our portal to boot up your infrastructure whenever you want, now you can actually provide more continuous and more often scans of your applications by using the DR site. Instead of just having a once-a-year intrusive scheduled vulnerability penetration test, leverage the fact that you have a replica that you can boot up whenever you want, and that your security tools are there too. And so we can kind of flip it on its head. We can say, don't let your DR infrastructure give you security exposure. Instead, do it right and let it actually make your production more secure. So the last thing is, that we want to kind of talk about today, and then I think we're probably going to wrap up, is we mentioned a lot of stuff. We talked about a lot of different facets of disaster recovery and nuances and dealing with the network and VDI and always on and all these integrations. But you really got to consider, what is your appetite to take ownership and accountability for all that? IT teams today are kind of overwhelmed with not only managing infrastructure, but unfortunately a lot of the security work gets put on their plate. And we're very hybrid today with different platforms that they have to manage. And so really ask yourself, what is your appetite to take ownership and accountability of it? Or to what extent would you rather outsource it to a managed provider, like Webair? So with a managed provider, you're not buying target infrastructure. You're not consuming vCPUs and memory. You're basically just contracting for an SLA. And here's a guarantee from a provider that your infrastructure will boot up, guaranteed, let's say within an hour, and be no older than 15 minutes, of production. And so for some organizations, they'd rather have those assurances and have legal liability for their data from the provider, and have a contractual obligation from the provider. And just, DR is one of those easy things to outsource because it doesn't really require a lot of changes at your production environment. Besides installing a replication tool like Zerto, which is very easy to integrate, you don't have to go and retool your entire environment. So if you have multiple initiatives, low-hanging fruit is definitely DR. You can outsource that very quickly. But again, it's something that you have to figure out as an organization. You can use public cloud as a target for DR2, but then it's up to you to be accountable and responsible to manage all that and ensure that you're securing it the right way and monitoring the RPOs and all that. So it's not something that I can't advocate one's better than the other, because it's a decision that each organization has to make. But here's a nice list of all of the things that a DRaaS provider like Webair will provide as part of that service. And I think an interesting way to look at it is you have companies like Zerto who are building these tools. And Zerto is, from what I see, is constantly innovating, for the first bucket, for people that want to do it themselves, their own infrastructure at another physical facility, but they're also innovating for companies like Webair so that it can be done as a service. There's a whole separate set of tools and software that Zerto provides us so that we can do this as a service. So Deepak, I'm assuming that you guys wouldn't be doing that if this as a service, DR as a service model wasn't prevalent out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, DR as a service has been one of our largest portions for Zerto since the beginning, right? It's not something that we did as an afterthought. It's been since the inception. So from product side, I can tell you that what we do is, as we're releasing new features, new functionality, there's always the thought to say, okay, how is this going to work in a as a service environment? Well, what are we gonna do in terms of permissions? And there are different models out there. Somewhere, maybe providing a white glove service. Others where you're hosting the environment, but the customer may actually have their own administrator that needs to be manage their own environment. So different classes of tenants, if you will, with a different expertise. So all of those things we take into account, but we haven't seen, even with the onset of public cloud, we have not seen a reduction by any means in as a service model. In fact, if anything, we've seen as a huge uptick where you know, as a service providers are able to extend some of their capabilities into public cloud as well. So that's the direction I've seen.
Awesome. And just with the 1 minute I have left here, I just want to point out, this is what you actually get. If you're consuming disaster recovery as a service from Webair, we will provide DR for VMware, Hyper-V, physical servers, the IBM, everything we spoke about, all the issues and nuances that I covered, we will take care of during our onboarding. We'll present you with the different options. Then we'll actually own failover. You can log into our portal and fail over yourself whenever you want, but you can also call us and say, hey, you know, we're down, please fail us over right now. So we'll take ownership of that. We'll take ownership of failback. We'll take ownership of creating the runbook, providing you with the different network integration strategies, actually setting it all up. We provide we do managed testing twice a year. And so there's complete self-service capability, but you can leverage us as a managed provider. We also allow our customers to use the replica infrastructure at no additional cost for 3 days out of every month for legitimate cases or for additional testing. This is where we have recovery environments. So it's about 8 locations around the world. We're very big into sovereignty, data locality, and also work with very large organizations that require DR in different environments, as well as providing compliance requirements for healthcare organizations, legal and defense contractors, state and local government. You know, we shine when it comes to these compliance requirements. And then, you know, there's a lot that I spoke about today. You know, I can show you, you know, how all those requirements ended up mapping out for a bank, you know, or for a hospital. So there's all these different puzzle pieces, and it's going to show up differently for different organizations. But if you have a provider like us that's done the integrations, you know, hundreds of times over, we've seen what works, we've seen what doesn't, and we can leverage that experience to you know, do it the right way for each of our customers. So thank you for joining the webinar today. And just as a reminder, if you did register and attend the webinar, you're eligible for 5 terabytes of free disaster recovery storage replication with us for the first 3 months of service. So write to us at webinars@webair.com. Thank you very much. If there's any questions, I think we're kind of out of time, so please email us if you have any questions and we will follow up. Deepak, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Sagi. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you, and look forward to working with you more in the future.
You too, thanks.